Early in the 14th century, the world began to enter a phase of much cooler climate, and this was to have a tremendous impact on the world that the Mongols had stitched together. As the climate cooled, disease also spread, and the end was the complete collapse of the Mongol Empire. The world climate had entered a relatively warm stage around the year 900 of the Common Era, so the development of the High Middle Ages was benefited by taking place during a time when the ice pack receded and travel across the North Atlantic was relatively simple. But beginning in the Arctic in the 13th century, a cooling trend sets in that's going to last for the next 500 years. Evidence for this cooling trend comes from all parts of the Northern Hemisphere, from China, from Europe, from Africa, and from North America. Even though mean temperatures were only a little colder, the effect of even a relatively small change in temperature was drastic. Contemporary accounts talk about how miserable the weather is, how the crops fail, how food becomes scarce, how the rain never ceases. So there is plenty of evidence for the impact of climate. Some examples of the evidence for the impact of the climate change. In China, 1/3 of the winters of the 14th century were colder than the normality that had been established in the century before that. And during the reign of the Shundi Emperor, the last of the Yuan dynasty, from 1333 to 1368, in every year of his reign, more than 30 years, in some part of China, there was a climate-caused famine. In Europe, glaciers expanded, affecting shipping. And in Norway, for instance, we know that glacial expansion drove farmers to lower altitudes. Bad weather affected crops at the beginning of the 1300s. Famine was very common. Evidence from Africa includes the disappearance of water-demanding plant life from the areas around Lake Chad because the water was tied up in the ice pack. And in North America, climate change appears to have contributed to the end of the civilization that we know as the Hohokam civilization in Arizona, whose remnants can be seen in places like Casa Grande. The period of colder climate, crop failures, and inclement weather coincided also with the spread of massive outbreaks of what is known as the Black Death, the plague. Over the perspective of centuries, it's difficult to decide exactly what the plague was. We're faced with the problem of making a medical diagnosis from written reports that are several centuries old. Contemporaries wrote down what they observed, but they might not have been asking the questions or observing the things that a modern medical doctor would be interested in knowing about. It's possible, as we believe, that the bubonic plague, which is similar to the outbreaks of today, was part of it, given some of the symptoms that are described, and yet other symptoms are clearly of a different type of plague, one spread through the lungs and therefore known as pneumonic plague, and some of the pathogens may have been unique to the time. So scholars today generally believe that it was likely that several diseases mixed into some kind of lethal cocktail was what was involved in the Black Death. Quite likely there was some link to domestic animals. Animal husbandry was very long practiced in China, and the animal-human disease barrier was often crossed. Contemporary accounts note that domestic animals suffered from the plague as much as the humans did, which seems unusual, and yet it is in many different accounts from different locations. The exact relationship of these outbreaks of disease to the colder climate is also not entirely clear. The plague struck in different seasons of the year, in different weather, so it didn't seem to be affected by those factors. However, it did not appear strongly in hot and moist climates. Hot, dry, cold, wet, yes, but not hot, moist. And it's true that many of the pathogens of the plague remained active as long as the global climate cold trend lasted. So that suggests at least some link to the cold weather. If scholars have a hard time deciding exactly what the plague was, at least you might think we know where it came from. And it is true that it's easier to trace the plague's routes than it is to decide what it was. Still, there's need to be a little bit skeptical about what contemporaries said about it. Nearly all contemporaries describing the plague say that it started in the east, usually in China, some say in the Mongol steppe, and then spread along the trade routes. It does appear to begin in China. First recorded accounts of diseases like the plague are from 1320, and by 1330, in some areas of China where recurrent outbreaks had happened every couple of years, mortality rates were around 90%. There's a recorded outbreak of the plague in the Black Sea port of Kaffa in 1346. So the plague had reached, if it was being transmitted from China, the western end of the Silk Roads by that time, and on a Genoese galley from Kaffa, it reached Italy in 1347 and spread through Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa between 1347 and 1349. Around 1360, there were renewed outbreaks in China, and indeed the plague returned recurrently for the next couple of centuries, both in China and in Europe. Even so, it's not exactly possible to say with total confidence that the disease in China caused or was even the same as the other outbreaks. There is probability, but we can't be 100% sure. What we can measure, in spite of some of the difficulties of taking accounts that are written by survivors at face value, is the impact of the Black Death. The immediate impact was incredibly high mortality rates. As I've already mentioned, in the 1330s, some parts of China had experienced 90% mortality rates. A few years after the plague struck in Spain, in Barcelona, 60% of the church offices were unfilled. According to manor records in England, 70% of the tenants had vanished. Similar records exist for parts of France, showing 70 to 80% of the tenants dead. And Ibn Battuta, the great Arab historian, records that 2,400 people died per day in Damascus in 1348, and records that over 1,000 were dying per day in Tunis seem believable when you consider. In the long run, in 1393, a major population census in China, interpreted by current demographic scholars, suggests that China's population then, at the end of the 14th century, was lower by 1/3 than it had been in the middle of the 14th century. Additional effects of the plague, besides the incredible mortality rates, included the stimulus that it gave to medical inquiry. People tried to explain the plague as a moral visitation of God for sin, but that's not really good enough when people are dying at such rates. And so scholars began to try to discover how to prevent it, what caused it. Many theories abounded. Without a germ theory of disease, it was impossible for contemporary scientists to understand its causes really. But generally, scholars who looked at the plague at the time focused on infection and contagion, and where authorities were able to enforce quarantine, lives were actually spared. Of course, the impact of the plague also involved the moral world. Good and bad effects. Many people profiteered from it. Many people gave in to license and the sort of sense of, if we're all doomed to die, why not have a good time now? But despair also led to resolve and self-sacrifice, especially among members of the clergy who were on the front line of exposure to the plague. And both in Europe and China, the plague and its experience gave strong impetus to the spread of millenarianistic ideas. Millenarianism is an idea that there is going to come a golden age. And peasant rebellions in England in the 1380s and the rebellions in China in the 1360s that overthrew the Yuan dynasty both partook of some of this millenarianism, an attitude about the future that doesn't entirely vanish from European religious thought, perhaps even down to the present day. There were areas where the plague did not reach. It had relatively little impact in Eastern Europe, at least until the 1380s, long after it had laid waste to the major centers of Western Europe. These regions, it's true, lay a little bit apart from the main European trading routes, which gives further support to the idea that the plague was spread along the trade routes. And as a result of being spared by the plague, and good fortune in their rulers, Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Kingdom of Bohemia were all ruled in the late 1300s by monarchs who are called the Great in the history of their kingdoms. Louis the Great in Hungary, Charles the Great in Bohemia, and Kazimierz the Great in Poland. The plague never reached Japan. It had very little impact in Southeast Asia, and it didn't manage to cross the deserts into sub-Saharan Africa, even though trade between plague-stricken North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa did exist and did continue. Other isolated societies, such as in North and South America and in the Pacific Islands, were spared the plague because of their isolation and the separation by miles of ocean from the plague-stricken societies. But all across that world that the Mongols had knit together, the impact of the plague was dramatic and really undid the Mongol achievement. To consider the effects of the plague on the world the Mongols had globalized, Let's begin by looking at it region by region. In China, of course, the population loss was dramatic. We've already mentioned the 90% death rates at the opening phase of the plague, the 1/3 contraction of the population by the end of the 14th century. So that was a very dramatic impact. And that and other factors contributed to the loosening of Mongol power in China. In 1368, as we shall see in a little more detail later, the Yuan dynasty was overthrown and the Ming dynasty replaced it, restoring a native Chinese ruling dynasty to the throne and transferring the mandate of heaven from the heirs of Genghis Khan to local Chinese. In economic terms, China suffered, at least temporarily, from the loss of the commerce and trade that the secure and relatively easily traversed Silk Road of the Mongol era had given them, and the government also lost revenues and lost taxes. These could be recouped in later years as the population recovered, but the impact was significant at the beginning of the Ming era. In Europe, the effects of the plague had some similarities. In social and political terms, there was, as in China, a massive population loss. In terms of occupational strata, it affected the clergy dramatically, but it also had a leveling effect in all areas. In the parts most seriously hit by the plague, in Western and Central Europe, serfdom actually declined because the labor shortage made it more difficult for landlords to control the lives of the peasants who worked the land. This was not true in Eastern Europe, which had been spared the plague, and where it still was common enough to have serfdom. Monarchs and aristocratic families were weakened as families died out. Ruling dynasties had to change. Noble power was weakened. Religiosity increased, but it became more personal. The Franciscan style replaced that of the others. For many people on the fringes of European society, the plague years were very fateful because they were scapegoated. This was particularly true of Europe's Jews, who were blamed for the spreading of the plague and who were often the target of violence by mobs and expulsion by rulers, until at the course of the end of the 14th century and into the 15th and 16th centuries, most of the Jews of Western Europe had been expelled and ended up moving to the much more hospitable territories ruled by the King of Poland and Lithuania, so that the majority of the Jews in Europe ended up living in Eastern Europe. Overall, in a state of crisis, people turned to the monarch, hoping that he would be able to do something, and therefore the state emerged from the plague relatively stronger and in a stronger position vis-a-vis the church than had been the case before. This was true in Europe, less so in the steppe land where the Mongols controlled things. But to continue with the effects of the plague in Europe, its economic impact was mixed. Initially, there was a collapse of the economy and serious deflation, but there was still a desire for luxury goods. In fact, the desire for luxury goods increased, and the leveling effects of the plague and the impact it had on various social niches made different opportunities for making money available to people. As the population recovered, the economy will eventually take off. Still, the plague years ended many of the initiatives of the preceding period. North Atlantic exploration and navigation essentially ceased. The last Icelandic exploration voyages to North America ended in the mid-14th century. And the progress that the Portuguese in particular had made in exploring the Atlantic African coast and the wind patterns and navigation of the southern African Atlantic was also halted. After the mid-14th century, it would be practically another century before regular attempts to continue to expand and advance European knowledge of the Atlantic coasts were taken up again. The Muslim world, too, experienced the impact of the plague, and it had major social, political, and economic effects there. Of course, in the Muslim world, too, the population loss was massive. In Ilkhan Persia, it weakened the rule of the Ilkhans, already declining through internecine strife within the dynasty. The last Ilkhan died in the middle of the 14th century and was succeeded by various local warlords, from whom eventually would emerge the Safavids, who reestablished a united Persian empire on the ruins of the Timurid Empire, which we'll talk about later on. Economic effects of the plague were like those of Western Europe, made worse by Ilkhan mismanagement of the economy in Persia. The impact of the plague in the Mongol steppe was also dramatic, population loss and weakening of traditional control, and it increased the breakup of the Mongol Empire into various components. One consequence of this was that the control that the Mongols exerted over Russia was dramatically loosened and set the stage for the return of Russian sovereignty and eventually the emergence of Muscovy. In a broader sense, too, the ending of Mongol rule created a situation that played into the developments of the next century as various parts of the world, including Europe, recovered. One of the driving forces of Europe's aggressive outward reach in the next century was in fact how desperate its situation was following the plague. When there was nothing more to lose and very much to be gained if something could be done, it was a great stimulus to exploration, to attempts to reestablish contact with those rich Eastern societies about which now Europe knew and which it had experience of. And that played something into the expansion of European attempts to find a way back to Asia, even if it meant sailing through uncharted oceans. If the 14th century was disastrous for the global world that the Mongols had stitched together, the 15th century saw certain recovery and expansion. I want to look first of all at the areas where the plague hadn't really reached that much, to look at some of the states that expanded during that time. First of all, in sub-Saharan Africa, where the plague hadn't actually reached. In East Africa, in the 15th century, there is a development in Ethiopia as the Christian mountain-dwelling Ethiopian elites begin to extend their control in an imperial way down into the lowlands, establishing, against pressure from the Muslim Arabs and from some Europeans, an independent African-ruled state. Further down the coast in East Africa, in the region in present-day Zimbabwe, there is the appearance of fortified city sites which give their name to the country. They were known as Zimbabwes, and they were walled compounds where local rulers could gather trade-related strength. And one of the most significant is known as Great Zimbabwe, and is still an amazingly impressive, even in its ruined state, amazingly impressive testimony to what the local societies were able to create. A similar rising state based on trade, Mwene Mutapa, developed in that region, did not control the coastline, but traded through intermediaries with Arabs and others in the Indian Ocean. In West Africa, the state of Mali, which had risen in the beginning of the 13th and 14th century to a major power. The ruler of Mali, Mansa Musa, made a very famous pilgrimage to Mecca before the plague struck. And in the course of his pilgrimage, he spent so much gold and donated so much gold to religious institutions that he caused serious inflation in Egypt and on the way to Mecca. Mali declined as it became cut off from its sources of gold and trade with North Africa, and in the end was replaced by another state, Songhai, which covered some of the same territory, but also benefiting from the link between the Niger River Valley and the Mediterranean coast, but never rose to quite the same power that Mali had. Further down the west coast, the Kingdom of Congo became known to Westerners in particular because of its contacts with Portugal and the Portuguese seafarers who had eventually reached that far down the coast of Africa. All of these examples from sub-Saharan Africa include some states and some transcending almost empire-type structures. These societies had contact with outside sources of commercial and political expansion, which might have generated their efforts to expand their society's reach and to increase its political control. The situation was a little bit different in the Americas, but the 15th century saw the expansion there of two native empires, each of which was a dominant force in its part of the continent for a time, but which differ from the European and African empires in interesting ways. The Inca Empire in South America and the Aztec Empire in Mesoamerica, modern-day Mexico, both are examples of what might be called ecological imperialism. because their existence is made possible by the fact that they expand to control different climate zones and therefore different and varied sources of food and other products. The Andes Mountains were the backbone of the Inca Empire, and they created a tribute system that led their conquered peoples to provide them with foodstuffs and other forms of tribute. They were very ruthless towards their conquered peoples, wiping them out, relocating them, treating them quite harshly, which generated antipathy back towards them, of course. The Aztecs in Mexico, based in their center in what is today Mexico City, also expanded across ecological zones. Unlike the Incas, their society interfered less in the tributary societies that they conquered and controlled, but they stretched all the way down to the rainforests of Guatemala and further south, and to the arid northwestern desert lands to the north and west. Both of these empires, as well as the African states, proved to be rather fragile. But in Eurasia, new land empires rose, which were of longer duration. In the Muslim world, the torch is passed to the Ottoman Turks, an example of the rise of the Turkic peoples as the standard bearers of Islam in its struggle against the Christian and other non-Muslim enemies of the faith. The Ottomans began, in fact, in particular, the Ottomans began as warriors on the border of Islam, Ghazis, as they called themselves. They established themselves with a capital at Bursa in Anatolia in the 14th century, from which they began to press on Byzantium. Their expanse was interrupted by the lightning-like explosion of the empire of Timur the Lame, Turkic-speaking nomad who united the people of the steppe into a great personal empire and fought with the Mongols north of him and the Ottomans to his west and the Delhi Sultanate to his east. Indeed, at one stage he defeated the Ottoman Sultan and imprisoned him in a silver cage. But with his death, his empire fell apart, and the Turks resumed their pressure especially on Europe. Finally, in 1453, as we'll see in more detail in a later lecture, the Turks conquered Constantinople and seized the mantle of the old Roman Empire, focusing their interest on the Mediterranean and on the European part of the Mediterranean world. North of the Ottomans, on Europe's eastern edge, a new center arose, Russia. Moscow became the focal point around which, as the Russian historians said, the Russian lands were gathered. The dynasty that became famous as the rulers of Moscow begins with Ivan I, who essentially was invested with the duties of tax collector by the Mongols and parlayed that into extension of his control over several of the neighboring city-states from his site in Moscow. His grandson Ivan III married a Byzantine princess just before the last Turkish conquest of Constantinople, and when Constantinople fell, he adopted the Byzantine double-headed imperial eagle into his coat of arms and began using the title Tsar, which is a Slavic version of the Roman Caesar. And his successor, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, expanded Moscow dramatically. Ivan III and Ivan IV, known as the Terrible, this, by the way, is a translation of a Russian term, Grozny, which might be better translated as terror-inspiring rather than terrible. It doesn't mean that he was just cranky and ill-behaved, but that he inspired dread. There's a famous late 19th, early 20th century British historian who insisted on using the term John the Dread to talk about Ivan the Terrible. But it was Ivan the Terrible who expanded Moscow's control into the Volga Basin, eventually pushing the Mongols out, as well as benefiting from the eastward movement of Russian missionaries and colonists who moved into the forests of the Siberian north. There they found a rich trade in furs gathered by the local peoples that made the princes of Moscow wealthy. China in the 14th century also recovered from the effects of the plague, beginning with a revolt from the peasants that overthrew the Yuan dynasty. Peasant revolts up and down the Grand Canal, where the peasants were being drafted as forced labor, led to the breakup of Yuan control and the emergence of various generals, and one of them, Chu Yuanzhang, managed to, by ruthless application of force, unite everyone behind him and finally drive the Yuan dynasty out and establish a new dynasty for which he took the name Ming, bright, implying the Buddhist suppression of the Mongols. So he drove the Mongols out but kept some of their practices. However, he did return some of the traditional Chinese practices, such as the examinations in the Confucian classics, for state service. And his son, the Yongle Emperor, as he is called, continued to look outward. This outward look is symbolized in particular by a series of major naval expeditions undertaken by a Muslim eunuch admiral named Zheng He, Cheng Ho in the old transliteration system, which began in 1405 and continued for 7 major voyages into the 1430s. Those voyages had different reasons for their existence, but they spread the Chinese, showed the Chinese flag and spread Chinese influence throughout the entire Indian Ocean. Under the Yongle Emperor's successor, however, China returned to its inward-looking traditions, and Zheng He's voyages ceased. In fact, the mandarins, the court bureaucrats, destroyed all the records of his expedition that they could find in the hopes of not betraying China to outward imperial ambitions. The Indian Ocean was the theater for Zheng He's voyages, and it was also one of the most important existing ocean-borne trading networks at the time. It was a kind of holy grail for the Europeans, who wanted desperately to hook into the Asian trade networks, but who couldn't easily get to the Indian Ocean. The only ways Europeans could get there were overland, either through Ottoman or through Persian-controlled territory, which posed certain difficulties, obviously. Gradually, however, they were developing the necessary technology as the Portuguese led the way down the coast of Africa, and as square-rigger ships were developed that replaced the triangular lateen-rigged sails of the Mediterranean. Eventually, at the end of the 15th century, a Portuguese expedition managed to round the tip of Africa and enter the Indian Ocean, reaching the Indian spice source city of Calicut in South India. At about the same time, in the 1490s, Christopher Columbus, with Spanish backing and Genoese financial support, reached the Caribbean, linking for the first time the Old World with the New. And so the ground was being set by the late 1400s and the early 1500s for the emergence of a new system of global trade, a system that was born on the waves of the oceans as Europeans and others finally figured out how to make use of the prevailing wind systems to link up societies that had previously been kept apart. And that's going to be a major theme for the next section of the class.